Hello everybody, welcome to the Scottish Rugby podcast brought to you by the Scottish Rugby blog. I am Cammy Black. We said at the end of last week's podcast, that was us for the summer. We were done. We were only going to do Patreon podcasts over the summer for our lovely Patreons. However, over the weekend, a big bit of news dropped that the RFU have proposed, and I've stressed it's proposed at the moment because it's got to go to a vote, have proposed a ban of transgender women in women's rugby. It's a total ban. And that came out, I think it was it Friday? It feels so long. It's been a long weekend, Johnny. Was it Friday? Friday.
It was Friday.
Friday that came out. So we've obviously, there's been a lot of discussion over the weekend about it, and we felt it was worth us just getting together to do a podcast. One, because it's an issue we've talked about before on the podcast a lot. And secondly, because as it stands, the Scottish Rugby Union policy remains unchanged, although there is a holding statement on the website that says it is under review. So we thought this is a good time to talk about it and put forward our views and also hear the views from other people as well. So joining me this evening, we have our two regulars. We've got Johnny McGinty and John Anderson. Good evening, both.
Evening.
Evening, Trips.
And I'm delighted to say that we are also joined by two very special guests. We've got Elis Martin, who plays for Heriots. Hello, Elis.
Hiya.
And we also have Sam Abdulla, who is the chair of the Thebands Rugby Club. Hello, Sam. Hello. Sam, I know. Is it Thebands or the bands? I can never get
Thebands. No, Thebands. Yeah. You got it right the first time.
It's my lack of classical education kicking in there. You see.
I mean, I don't know how you didn't get it straight away. I thought everyone knew classical Greek references.
Well, I think that's it. I think it's also kind of like the BAMs as well. That's kind of what comes to mind. But
that's actually what they teach in the Borders.
That's where you get taught in the Borders.
I was in the Borders last week, and I know for a fact that is true.
I'm going on Friday.
Lovely. Anyway,
no, you're not. We're not getting into this again, but no, you're not.
We'll talk about that. We'll save that for the debate about where Dumfries and Galloway is for later. Anyway, so as I said, we're going to talk about this issue. Sam, I'd like to start with you. Obviously, Thebands is it's an inclusive rugby club. Kind of, it's mainly kind of, well, you can explain kind of inclusive from it's gay, bisexual players, but it's open to everybody. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're so the Caledonian Thebands, we're Scotland's first LGBT inclusive rugby club. So predominantly we aim to create a safe space for LGBT plus people and their allies to kind of engage with rugby, play rugby, support rugby, just be part of the rugby community that I guess everyone in this podcast enjoys being part of. We celebrated just a couple of months ago our 20th anniversary. So since 2002, we've been kind of at the forefront of LGBT inclusivity in at least in men's rugby in Scotland.
Yeah, and Elis, you're kind of sorry, Sam.
I was just saying.
Oh, Sam's frozen a little bit. We'll hopefully catch Sam in a moment. Elis, are you currently playing for Heriots? Is that right?
Yeah. I just transitioned, came out of uni, the kind of uni rugby sphere, and this is going to be my first season coming back into Scottish rugby since I was, I think, 17. So yeah.
Okay, exciting times. I'm kind of interested to get your take on this, Elis, for kind of to open up with it, because like I said, we're not kind of having a debate tonight. It's kind of we're just having a discussion about the issues. I suppose you're on a panel here of 4 guys and you, but so
Yeah.
we were really keen because one of the common kind of subjects that come up, I suppose, is you're a man. What do you know? You're talking about this is about women's spaces. How from your point of view, without putting you on the spot, kind of how do you kind of feel about playing in a team, I suppose, with a transgender woman?
Honestly, like I've played with all sorts of women. There's plenty of cis women who are 6'2" and play rugby, and I just think it's a space for everyone. So it's kind of deeply disheartening that would ever be jeopardized by something as silly as this. I have played alongside tons of different sexualities and gender representations, and never once have I felt uncomfortable. And I know a lot of people in my position who would say the same. So yeah, the feeling towards it is complete indifference, to be honest. They're just like any other teammate. So yeah, it's really disappointing that it's ever even questioned, I think.
Yeah, and Johnny, that's it, isn't it? Because we've got Sam here from an inclusive rugby club. You're involved with been involved in inclusive teams as well. So it does feel slightly disappointing that we're here, I guess, in the sport.
Yeah, it really, really is, because for me, the main thing about rugby is that it's always been a sport that tries to make it so that if you want to play, you can play. So we've played Thebands before, actually, a few times. The Knights, which is my team, and we're not an IGR team. There are no gay people on our team, and we're a vets rugby team. But the opportunity to play Thebands came up, and we were just like, yeah, of course, yeah, we'd love to play them. Like, if somebody wants to have a game, then we will have a game. And that's, to me, that's what it's always been like. I played in a charity thing a couple of years ago where 2 consecutive games back to back on the same day. The first game I played against the King Penguins, who are a touring team, and basically like one of the qualifications to be in the King Penguins is that you have to have been involved in an international setup. So I played against Tom Smith. And then in the next game, we played against the Clan, and I played against the guy who has Down syndrome. And like that is rugby for me. And obviously, playing against somebody with Down syndrome is not the same as playing against the British Lion. You play differently. We have to make adjustments to what we do and things like that. But still, without hesitation, we go straight into, if somebody wants to play rugby, we will find a way for them to play. So to now be in a place where we're looking at an official policy that's going to stop an entire group of people from being able to play, it's just really upsetting, to be honest.
Yeah. And John, I think our starting point with this has always been that transgender women are women. And I think part of the difficulty with the discussion, certainly online and elsewhere, is that if that's not the starting point for other people, then the debate becomes lost in something else entirely, and it's actually got nothing to do with sport at all.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've noticed, certainly in some of the debates I've had over the weekend, is that, as you rightly say, that's the starting point. And for me, that is a non-negotiable starting point. It's a fact for me. And as you rightly say, if other people don't necessarily believe that, then it's very difficult to have an informed debate about the merits or the potential issues that could arise from any decision either way. It does get bogged down in a much dirtier sort of discussion that doesn't necessarily mean we get to a good outcome for professional sport, elite sport, amateur sport, any sport. It kind of does get bogged down in some of the semantics of it, which I think the issue deserves more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really keen that on this podcast, and for anybody listening, we're not talking about any wider debates that are happening in Scotland right now about changes to birth certificates. And this is purely about sport, and within the Equality Act 2010, which applies in England as well as in Scotland, because I know this because it's my job and I have to know this stuff. It's section 195 of the Equality Act refers specifically to sport, and it gives sport an exemption for allowing to categorize the participation of sport relating to sex, because the Equality Act prohibits discrimination against sex, but also against people who have undergone gender reassignment. And the law says that people who have undergone gender reassignment can be excluded from the participation of gender affected activity if it is, and this is the key word for me, if it is necessary to do so to secure, in relation to the activity, A, fair competition, or B, safety of other competitors. And I suppose that brings us on to the first kind of big issue that everyone will throw about in this debate, Elis, which is that there is scientific evidence of some description, and there's been studies on this that say that transgender women who have gone through male puberty have an advantage against the average woman. And I think that's the difficulty that I have with it, and it sounds like you may also have, is that with rugby in particular, we're not talking about averages. It's not like we're talking about cross country runners where everybody is exactly the same build. Do you know what I mean? Rugby's a sport for all shapes and sizes and all builds, and it doesn't feel like talking about averages fits very neatly within our sport, I suppose.
Yeah, I honestly I anecdotally have one of my best friends who lives in Canada. She is 6'3", and she is a heck of a girl to play rugby against. And she's a cisgender woman, which she was assigned female at birth. And I have a trans friend who is 5'9", and honestly, I could break her really easily. And I think this idea that women are incapable of it's a shame, because it's just fitting into society stereotypes of women being feeble and damsel in distress. And if I go out on a rugby pitch, I go out to play rugby. I am tackling the same as men would. I am rucking the same. The scrums are the same, and there will be strength differences between the men's and the women's game. But I think introducing trans women into rugby is not going to change the safety that is involved. I mean, in the England report, they said there were 6 registered trans players in England.
Yep.
And the thought that 6 trans women are going to put 15,000 women at risk, to me, is just ludicrous. It's completely ludicrous. Like, I have to laugh, because I'm like, I cannot believe that this has come into effect with this pseudoscience. Because also, when they're saying, you're 30 times more likely to get injured if you're getting tackled by a trans woman. Which study is this from? Because it doesn't make sense to me personally. But that's it's honestly ludicrous. I feel like I'm in a different world. It's barbaric.
I've got a question actually on that 30 times more likely thing, right? Because so myself, Sam, and Elis are all still currently playing. John and Cammy, you've both played. Have you ever made an identical tackle twice in your entire rugby career?
Never once.
So how can you
I've
say?
never made a tackle, Johnny?
Neither of you, Johnny. To be fair,
my tackles are probably single figures as well. But you can't go.
Wild.
You can't go this. You're more likely to injure someone in a rugby tackle doing this, because you cannot say that, because no 2 tackles are the same.
No.
So you can't go, that's a rugby tackle, and it's 30 times more likely if this person does it, they're going to hurt someone than somebody else. Because
it's also it's not science, is it? It's someone sitting at a desk going, right, according to these stats, 1 trans woman has injured 1 person. That's it, 100 times more likely. That's it. They're injured.
Yeah.
But
with 7 or 6 or 7 as well. That's the thing.
Exactly.
I'm an analyst by trade, and I know fine well that six numbers does not make a reasonable data set.
No.
It's another thing though, that actually a lot of these the studies that they pulled these stats from, very few of them are actually even related to rugby. All of the where they brought that women are at a disadvantage from cis women are at a disadvantage from trans women comes from, like you say, kind of cross-country running or something, and it's just been randomly applied to the sport. Elis, you made the point. I mean, I'm 5'6" and I weigh 82 kilos. There are almost without fail in every game I've ever played at least 17 other people who are twice my size in height, weigh at least 20 kilos heavier than me, and it's just like, well, on you go, son. Have a nice game.
Enjoy yourself.
And I think the other thing for me is, it's so patronizing, the idea that just because somebody was assigned male at birth, that they're going to be a better rugby player. Like, it's underlined with misogyny, the idea that there's an unfairness, that because I was assigned male at birth, I'm a better rugby player than Elis. I can probably fundamentally tell you that is untrue. I barely make a pass, and I'm terrible at catching, but I give it my best. So there's that element to it as well. It's not just the faux safety; it's the idea that being assigned male at birth makes me a naturally better rugby player than a cis woman who's spent her entire life playing and training. It's wild.
I think.
And if it was,
go on, Alice.
I was just going to say, if it was actually about safety of people, if it was about the safety of people, then why are we then allowing trans men to go into men's rugby? Because surely, if they were assigned female at birth, that's completely unsafe for them. So why is it that, you know, trans women coming into women's rugby is this terrifying concept, and, you know, these wee cis women wouldn't be able to handle it, and yet a trans man is fine because, you know, the risk's in your hands. It's
Or why are we allowing Darcy Graham to smash Matteo Bastro into next week?
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? Because rugby is inherently on the range of sports that you could possibly participate in there. You know, we know rugby's right up there. We talk about regularly on the podcast with the long-term impacts of brain injuries, CTE. Nobody goes into a game of rugby with their eyes closed to that sort of thing these days. Everybody knows the inherent risks. Even, you know, me with my no tackles and, you know, haven't played in a good 20 odd years, remembers kind of looking and going, I'm not going to tackle him. I'm going to be on the other side of the pitch for him for the rest of the game because I've risk assessed him, and that's not happening.
I believe we call that a non-dominant tackle, Cammy.
It is. Or as Johnny calls it, playing fullback. But that,
I've learned the phrase "your man." It's the most important thing I've ever done.
But I think that's it. You know, rugby. It's hard to. You can't apply it to rugby because it is, as I was saying. You know, you have such a range of body types that take part in the sport, and it is inherently a dangerous sport to take part in. It's not golf.
Yeah. So somebody, when York RI ladies put their really, really good video out, it must have been Monday, I think. And this is the thing that's upsetting me so much about it, is that so many people who are driving the narrative clearly have a lot of interest in bigotry and no interest in rugby. Yeah, like 100%. Cammy, me and you and I have said this, like most of the people that we've blocked have got no interest in rugby at all. They just want to fight about trans people. And so one of those exact people had retweeted the York RI's video and been like, oh, thanks very much for letting me know that it wouldn't be safe for my daughter to play rugby at your club. And it's just like, at your club doesn't need to be included in that sentence because playing rugby is not safe. We all know that. Everyone who's involved in rugby knows that. So you're showing yourself to just have like a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're talking about here. If you're going, if your club's got trans women in it, then it's probably not safe. Like every rugby club is not safe, and we all know it. Like you accept that when you play rugby.
Yeah.
So if that's your level of understanding, get out of the conversation.
I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the current position in Scotland for transgender women to take part. And now, worryingly, the SRU have actually taken their policy down, or it's not available when you click through on the link. It used to be it's not there at the moment, which I'm hoping is just that they haven't maintained their website, which is not unknown because they once had the advert for a job advert on there that I retweeted that was 3 years out of date. So it's not unknown for the SRU not to have things up to date, but it might suggest it's under review. But I think at the present, the position is it's a risk-based assessment on a case-by-case basis. You have to get your testosterone levels down below a certain level, and to show that medically you've done so and be subject to testing to show that you've done so. And even then, as far as I can understand from the policy statement, they can still say no if, for example, some of the extreme examples that have been given is deemed that you are a risk. So I'm thinking, for example, Ross Ford decided to transition tomorrow and got his testosterone levels down, but they decided that actually having someone of Ross Ford's size for whatever reason was a risk. So, Sam, I guess that approach. Now, some people may not agree with that approach. I guess that it's maybe too draconian because that's quite an invasive thing to go through to just play the sport. But on the other hand, I suppose it meets the requirement of the Equality Act that there is some mitigation goes into it. There is some kind of thought that goes into the process of having trans women playing women's rugby. Oh, we've lost Sam on the internet. I'm hoping that his internet was a bit shaky earlier. Elis, how do you the current rules? Kind of, what's your take on it? It feels like sensible in a way, I guess. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis feels moderate to make sure that there are, that there's some checks and balances happening.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, I mean, I'm coming from probably a very extremely liberal and open standpoint. So I understand the need for something to put in place to put people's mind at ease. But I do still even think that is just a wee step too far. I think in the grand scheme of things, according to this report by England Rugby, I think it was six trans women playing rugby in England. And I just think for that amount of people, why are we so damn worried about it? If that makes sense. I would say in the whole of England, there's probably 20 trans women that want to play rugby. Why are we putting their lives at risk? Why are we shunning them? Why are we telling them they can't do these things? Even getting testosterone, I don't actually know the exact figure, but I do remember looking, and it was about the Olympic committee, and like the level of testosterone that it needs to be is lower than a lot of women who play rugby who are cis women. So it's not even a low amount for a male at birth. It's actually a ridiculously low amount of testosterone, even for a cis woman. So I mean, even that, I do think it's still very rigorous. But if it puts people's mind at ease, then yeah, it's better than nothing. But that's my standpoint on as it is that we should stop getting ourselves worried about it. Really,
I have the numbers if you want them, because they're in Jess's article. If no one's seen it, Jess Hayden from the Times wrote an article about where she spoke to some of the trans women, and so she put it in. They have to demonstrate the concentration of testosterone in their blood serum has been less than 5
millimoles.
nmols per liter. I don't know what that is. What the actual term is, for a period of at least 12 months before application, and it had to remain the same for them to remain eligible. And Jess has put in, men usually have 10 to 35, while a women's level is normally 0.5 to 2.4. So in rugby, they will allow slightly higher than sort of what they think is a standard for women. But one of the women who Jess interviewed said that her testosterone readers were coming back at 0 anytime she got it done.
Wow.
So she's way below anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Even though she's allowed up to 5 millimoles. Thanks, Elis. She's at 0, and she's playing at 0, which is less than female cis players.
Yeah. Sam, what's
Elis,
your take? Go on, you're John.
On you go, Cam. I was just going to ask Elis a quick question, actually. Just from the way you were speaking there, I think I get the feel that you play rugby. You play against all sizes of rugby player, and I think you seem to support that there's absolutely no reason why there should be any sort of limitation on people.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I don't know if that's from my other background. I'm a member of the LGBT community. I have trans friends. I have non-binary friends. I have lesbian, gay, bisexual friends. And I think I'm part of the LGBT community just as much as I'm part of the rugby community. So I'm wondering if that's maybe why I'm quite so liberal about it and quite so, kind of who cares. But I don't feel threatened by the idea of people being welcome in spaces. And I think that's totally where this is rooted for me.
I think that's kind of where I ended up with this, because I'll be honest, when the debate first started a couple of years ago, I kind of got to the point where I thought, if I'm honest, I'm not really sure. When the wider debate in society was happening, I thought, I'm not really sure whether this is anything I need to kind of know about. It all seems very confusing. And then it came into rugby, and I thought, and for my shame, I thought I probably should know about this now, because it's now affecting the podcast that I do on a regular basis. It's something we probably want to talk about, because I'm a 40-year-old man, and I have lots of straight friends, and I'm white, and all my friends are white, and that's where I am in life.
Yep.
And so I find a lot of it very confusing, but that's not to say that I can't ask questions. And I think that's the issue I think a lot of people have. And Johnny, we were involved in a conversation kind of earlier today, and I think that's where I think a lot of people are with this in general, is that unless you are kind of involved in the discussions regularly, and maybe it can maybe be confusing for some people to kind of an older generation, particularly, I think, to have to kind of suddenly deal with these issues without having kind of that regular day-to-day lived experience of having people, encountering people who are non-binary, people of different of different sexualities. It can be confusing, and I think that the position, it's hard to get people to a point of saying, just ask questions, and people will give you answers if you ask them in a fair and reasonable way. John, you look like you're about to speak.
Or were you just I was agreeing with you.
Oh, okay.
No, I was completely agreeing with you. Ask questions. If you ask reasonable questions, reasonable people will give reasonable answers. If you ask questions of donuts, they might not.
Yep.
Sam, what's your take on the kind of current restrictions that kind of the SRU have on transgender women? Do you think they maybe go a little too far, or is it kind of the right balance of kind of allowing participation?
Firstly, can people hear me? Because my internet dropped out, so I don't know if my sound's come back.
That's your sound is back now. Yeah. You're here.
Perfect. I think I kind of sit in a similar position to Elis. I don't think it's great that people have to go through rigorous kind of testing to say that they're allowed to play. I think there's something slightly dehumanizing about that, and it already others a group of people. Nobody here had to undergo any testing to say that you could play rugby. You just turned up one day at training or wherever it was that you got started. If it's what makes people feel safe and it encourages inclusion, then absolutely fine. Then if that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. I think where the proposal from the RFU comes in, and I'm probably going to misquote it here, but it talks about the fact that we can't do a case-by-case analysis of people and get people to undergo medical examination because there is a chance they might be excluded. So instead of taking that chance, what we're going to do is start off at a position of just excluding you anyway, so that there's not a chance that you might be excluded, which is surely to God the most backwards approach. Like, if you don't start from a position of trying to foster inclusivity, you're going against what I think everyone here has already said. It's one of the core values of rugby. It's a sport for everyone. Yep. And if you aren't starting at that position, then something's gone really wrong. There's six, we've talked about already, there's six trans women in England who this affects. Every single one of them has passed the assessment. Every one of them undertook the assessment because that's what they needed to do. So what's the issue of these people who might not pass that assessment? They all have. It's mental. It's wild.
Yeah, I think this is where it might fall down, because the Equality Act, and I don't want to kind of bring it back to kind of the technical issues, because I know there's two arguments here. There's the technical kind of legalistic arguments, and then there's the moral arguments. But from a technical legal point of view, the Equality Act it talks about being necessary, and to restrict, it has to be necessary to restrict it in that way. And the notes say to uphold fair and safe competition, but not otherwise. So you can't restrict for any other reason other than to uphold fair competition. So if the current system is working and it does it on a case-by-case basis, then a total ban must surely fall foul of the Equality Act, because you can't just, a 5'9", 9-stone scrum half, transgender woman scrum half, coming and playing rugby. It would be very hard, I would think, for the RFU to say that restricting their participation was necessary. And I think that's possibly where it's interesting. We kind of, on the grapevine, there may be things in the pipeline should the RFU go that way, but I think that it would certainly fall foul of that, I think, Sam, as you say, because it's the blanket ban just doesn't make sense. And I wonder whether one of the things, John, is there's a conflation, I think, that happens online between discussions about elite sport and grassroots sport, that somehow all of a sudden, men from the English Championship who've really struggled to make it in rugby are all suddenly going to transition and suddenly become very successful in elite women's sport. And for all manner of reasons, that'd be quite an extreme life decision to make, and quite a life-altering life decision to make, just to be successful in rugby, and and also having confidence of their skill, overconfidence in their skills as well. But that's
Yes, something.
I think there is an element to the 7 players we're talking about in England, particularly. None of them are playing at elite level.
One of them was as a male in South Africa, by the way.
Okay, but not now. But
one-
they're not. But they're not asking to play elite level now.
No, so she was one of the people who Jess interviewed. And again, if you haven't gone onto the Times and seen Jess Hayden's article, please go and read it. But one of the ladies who she interviewed was a semi-professional rugby player in South Africa, playing at like district semi-professional level in South Africa, moved over here, and now will freely admits in the article that she's like not in the top half of decent players on her club side in England. So like this idea that semi-professional rugby players are going to transition to then become professional women's players and rake in all the non-existent money that they think women's players are getting is just like
that's
women's rugby reality.
Women's rugby is swimming with money, of course, and the success that you can achieve in women's rugby is it's an absolute joke, isn't it? And Squidge made a very good point about the obviously the transition periods and the stand down period, and it's almost 5 years that could be required, and that's if you're talking about elite sport. We've talked about, I know it's not the same thing, but let's talk residency for a second. 5 years for residency, and we've talked about people not wanting to move to another country because it's now 5 years, and that's too long in professional sport. Funnily enough, 5 years is a long time in professional sport. It's like half your career almost, and there's no way. It's just people are just grasping at straws to try and get this to suit their bigoted agenda.
I think the thing that like I find wild about that idea that all of a sudden these semi-professional men are going to transition so that they can be at the top of the women's game is, then why haven't they done that in the last 3 years since the RFU had the rule that you could? All of a sudden they just didn't realize, but now is the moment where they're going to do it. But because the Women's Six Nations was on BBC Two this year, that's what really got them going. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
It struck me with something when I was preparing for the podcast. There was an article I was reading, and it kind of struck me. And again, we've kind of talked about it before. And Elis, you touched on it actually. Or maybe I think Sam, you mentioned Sam, me, Johnny, John. None of our bodies are regulated playing sport, or ever would be. No. But for women, even if you are a cis woman, there is still an unacceptable level of testosterone that you can go past in your body that would exclude you from taking part in elite sport. There are still restrictions on, say, black women swimmers not being able to wear certain, wear swimming caps that suits their hair because swimming organizations have banned it. So this doesn't just, I think this to me, this isn't just about kind of about transgender women, but it's also about women's right in sport. Elis, I think that women have their bodies regulated to a ridiculous degree in sport, and this, I think, is just an extension of that. Nobody kind of talk. Everyone talks about Lionel Messi taking growth hormones when he was younger as a great thing because it meant he grew into a great sportsman. Nobody says, "Oh well, Justin Gatlin was born with slightly longer legs than somebody else, so he should be made to give everybody else a 5-second head start." It just seems mad that and I don't think I'd realized, obviously there was a cast menu thing, but I don't think until you really read into it, how much women's bodies are actually regulated in sport, even taking transgender women out of it.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, I think as well, the thing that people don't realize, and I think the thing that you touched on really well earlier was that you were like, well, if I'm asking questions and I'm willing to learn, then that's a good thing, and that is a great thing. But women have these conversations every day. In fact, queer women have these conversations twice a day. Black queer women have these conversations probably every bloody minute of their lives, where they're having to explain to people why they should be allowed to exist in their space. And it just, I mean, I love what you're doing here, and this discussion is like, it's so amazing, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. But these discussions are happening, and unfortunately some of them are not going the way this is. A lot of them are probably going the opposite way, and people have to listen, and women especially have to listen all the time about how they're second best, they're subpar, they're never going to be as good. There's women I know that have capped for their country that have never seen any money for playing rugby. There's women that I know that have played other sports for their country and they've never seen any money. And it's that way where it's like this idea that, one, trans women are hiding around corners waiting to pounce on rugby and be the next big thing, or two, that there's male players hiding around the corner waiting to transition to become the next big thing. There is no big thing yet. Unfortunately, women's rugby is not at the place yet where there is a big thing. So this idea it's so ludicrous, and as you've said, it's just another way to regulate women and regulate queer people and regulate Black people and regulate all minority groups. And you feel it every day, and you have these discussions every day. I have this discussion over dinner with my flatmates every night, no doubt, because you have to be immersed in it because it's your life. Whereas everyone else can sort of pick it up and drop it whenever they want. Whoever's putting in this ban tomorrow can wake up and never think about it again. The trans woman who has just left her community of rugby players and her community of rugby friends has lost that now. That's it, gone for the rest of her life. The man who puts the ban in place doesn't need to think about it again tomorrow, and that is so heartbreaking that that's even the thing.
I think there's it was in that article that you were talking about, Johnny, from the Times, and it talks about exactly that. Elis, it's like this isn't just stopping people playing a game. This will hurt people. It will hurt people. I mean, one of the women who was in the article talked about the fact that it literally saved her life. She was actively suicidal, but becoming part of a rugby community again saved her life. And essentially, what this ban does is say, well, you're not wanted here.
Yep.
You might as well go back to that place. And it will actively injure people. Yeah.
The rates of suicide and mental illness within the queer community is baffling. The rates of suicide and mental illness within the trans community is another level entirely. And we have campaign after campaign about mental health, and yet we are banning a group of people from playing a sport. And sport, I mean, we all know, we've all played, it is the most community-based, emotionally fulfilling, etc. thing, and we're just going, nah, pack it in. That's
the thing that really, really gets me about this, is that, like, when one of my rugby playing friends moves house, whether they move to a new town or they move to the other side of the world, then there's this long-standing joke that's like, oh, you're gonna have to go join the rugby team if you want to make some new friends.
Yep.
And the thing is that's it's not a joke out of nowhere. Do you know what I mean? That's a joke because it's true. Because every time I've ever moved somewhere, I've been like, right, I'll find a rugby team and then I'll make some pals. That's what happens. Yeah. And Elis, you're absolutely bang on right that whoever is making this decision, who's going to put this ban in place, is just going to do it. Then that's going to be the end of it for them. They're not going to think about it anymore. But they are the same as us. They've been in that position where they're like, oh, I've moved to a new town. I'll go and join a new rugby club and I'll make some new pals. So they know what it means. And then they're going to just do it and forget about it. And it's just really, really upsetting that you could be in that position and do that to someone else.
Yeah. But that's how you know it's not about the rugby. That's how you know it's about being trans. And like you said, regulating people's bodies, regulating queer people, regulating women. That's what it is, because the whole rugby side of it is they know all the benefits that come from that. It's literally just about exerting that power where they can.
I think the thing for me is, now, if anybody hasn't read the book, I can't remember who it's by, James Felton, I think, he's written a couple of really good books. One is The History of Sun Through Headlines. And if you look particularly back to the ones in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, Sunburn it's called.
Sunburn, that's what it's called. Thank you, Johnny. Yeah. Really excellent book. And the way that gay people were treated by the Sun, and obviously in wider society as well, particularly by the Sun, the echoes of that in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, to how transgender people are now referred to in the media is frightening. I think when people have said online, "Oh, I'm not going to let my daughter join a rugby club because you've got this ban in," I'm thinking, well, actually, if I was an outsider to the sport and I'm not wrapped up in that, the culture wars, and I see that rugby's banned transgender women, then actually the opposite may be true. I'm not going to let my daughter join a sport that isn't inclusive, that's got wrapped up in the discrimination. John, it's not. It's another thing saying rugby. This is not a good look for rugby.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And rugby has, and we talked just before the podcast about how rugby union and rugby league have done their best, and there's obviously been examples of that in rugby league over the last wee while as well. They've done their best to make clear that rugby is an inclusive sport, but only if you're a white male of a certain religion, certain gender, certain belief system. The world has changed, society has changed, and a lot, quite most of us, well, certainly me, Johnny, Cammy, our parents here, and you make decisions based on that, and actually your desire for people to be part of something is much broader now than you don't just say, I just want you to go and play rugby. It is more about, you want people to be inclusive, you want people to be adhering to the values that we expect as a society, like a reasonable bunch of people. It's reasonable to expect inclusivity. It's reasonable to be expecting that women get treated properly. I've had I literally have quit a rugby club because women weren't allowed to go to the club dinner. Is that sort of thing where we have those situations where we expect more now. But decision makers are in that position where they maybe haven't quite moved along.
It's funny because there was a rugby club I looked at joining, and I was going to join the Thirds, which was just a social training on a Friday night, and it said on the advert, "Don't join us if you're not prepared for the banter." And I thought instantly, oh, okay, they're racist and homophobic. I'm not going to join that rugby club.
Exactly.
That's what I saw that as code for, and I was like, well, I'm not going to go along to that.
And that's the thing. You notice the flags. Like we've obviously, the fact we even have a woke klaxon is a little joke we have, but we are very well attuned to the rugby community. We've all been part of rugby for a long time, and we know when something's right, and we know when something, your alarm goes off when you see those things. So you're not wrong to pick that out, Cam.
Yeah. On that point, Elis, I'll come to you. Kind of the point that people made is it's going to discourage kind of young girls from taking up rugby. I just can't see that at all. I think that seems to be a very generational thing coming from people of a certain age. Perhaps I would imagine that and I'm not a young woman, so I can't speak for young women, but I would imagine young women these days would be more attracted to a sport that was more inclusive than one that was exclusive.
Yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head. I don't know any. I mean, so I've coached at a couple of high schools and stuff before, and the first point is I actually don't know any young women who actually really care whether you're trans or cis or non-binary or gay or straight, because they've grown up in a generation where there's so much accessibility to different communities. I mean, you've got TikTok, Instagram, all of these things, and these young girls who are exposed to rugby are also equally exposed to LGBT, racism, all of these things that they have to learn about and understand far, far quicker than even I had to understand. And I think that actually you're right. If me 5, 6, 7 years ago was thinking about what sport I want to join, I 100% would be like, oh, a ban on a full group of people? Nah, I'm okay. I don't want to do that. I'll go and do weightlifting instead, or I'll go and do swimming instead. I mean, swimming's no better, but I think that's, unfortunately, that list of sports that I could join is going down and down and down. But that's just a sad state of affairs, isn't it? I think, honestly, the more inclusive and the more supportive and smart rugby could be, the bigger it could grow. And I think that banning trans women from playing rugby is the silliest decision in terms of marketing for a sport that I've ever seen. It's silly. And not forgetting about the trans kids who will now not play rugby. They count when they're saying, oh, it'll discourage young girls from playing. Yes, it will discourage young cis girls And now, sadly, not only will it discourage young trans girls, but it completely blocks that path for them. And it's really sad, because it's not true at all. I don't think, anyway.
Yeah. Sam, I'll kind of ask you, because we're getting towards the end of our time. But if we imagine kind of, the SRU were listening into this podcast, what would you say to them as part of their kind of sat there thinking about their review of the policy and it going up for a vote with the council or I don't know, I lose track of the structure these days within the SRU. But, if they're sat there currently reviewing it at the moment, what would you say to them?
I guess I would tell them to take a look at some of the response from the rugby community as to this potential ban, where actually so many people are saying, no thanks, mate, this isn't our sport. And I guess one of the things, thinking about just what Elis was saying there, following on from all these other sports that are just making this decision to blanket ban trans women, why do that when what we could do, as what rugby has always done, I think, is be a leader in inclusivity, in being a leader in being a place where everyone is welcome. That's what I think I would say to the SRU, is that we can actually change hearts and minds and push society further forward by being inclusive, forward-thinking, liberal in our inclusion of trans people in rugby.
Yeah, and Elis, I assume you would agree wholeheartedly with that. That as a woman playing in Scotland right now, you don't see this as an issue that needs to be addressed within Scottish rugby.
Yeah, nah, not at all. Yeah, 100%. It's always been, especially in the women's game, it's always been be the best you. It's all about inclusivity. It's always, and then that's actually what's almost so sad about this, is that I joined rugby for that reason, because it was so well known for being a really inclusive space, both for different bodies and for different sexualities and different gender representations. I mean, women's sport in general is quite a queer space. I think it's quite an LGBT inclusive space, and rugby especially. And it's so against rugby, which is what's so baffling about it. So I agree. It was never an issue that had to be brought up. If anything, it was an issue that had to be changed for the other way, if that makes sense. So yeah, I totally agree with Sam there.
Yeah. And Johnny, go on, Sam.
So I was just going to say, I think the other thing that really worries about this, and it's been touched on earlier, is but then where does this regulation stop? Elis raised the point about trans men earlier. Then where does it become? You've got a cis woman who's tall and strong built, and other people decide that she's not what they consider to be a woman. Where does the regulation of people's bodies stop? It kind of opens the doors to some dodgy conversations, I think.
Yeah, I think that's something I've kind of had in my head to talk about, but we kind of, it's a good point to discuss it. I think in wider society, the concerning thing is now that there is a perception that transgender people are somehow entering into the mainstream, and so it's kind of the response to that in society is that we've seen stories in the press of cis women being accosted going into a women's toilet because someone perceives them to be a transgender woman when in fact they're a cis woman. And similarly, you could see that in rugby and in sport, is that if you have a total ban, then as with a ban on anything, it pushes things underground. Yeah. And what's to stop, an opposition player saying, I'm not playing against that person, even though they claim to be a cis woman, they're clearly not. And it then becomes all about perceptions. As you were saying, Elis, it's not that's not a good place for us to be in as a sport. If it's open, if it's inclusive to all, if we're having these discussions out in the open, then it's I don't know, it's more difficult for people to behave in that way, as to try and exclude people and try and kind of exclude people by perception.
Yeah, I think it's a scary door to open in my eyes. Because it does, as you've said, it opens the door to more. It opens the door to a restriction based on every woman has to do a testosterone test. If you're above a certain level, then you're not in. Caster Semenya, a brilliant example of that. She's been completely cast aside from her sport You know, and I also don't like saying, "Oh, despite being a cis woman," but but that's the truth. Despite being assigned female at birth, she is now unable to compete in that race because they've deemed her too man-like, and it's ludicrous. You know, is this ban to support and protect the safety of women, or is it to support the safety of a 5'1" pretty white woman that doesn't exist? It doesn't. It seems like fallacy to me. It seems like it's not actually a real thing.
Yeah. Nobody ever accused Ross Ford of being too manly a man, did they, Johnny?
Yeah.
No, that's it. And this is it. It's like the weird duality for me of a small, but because we have said, to be fair, that most of the grassroots rugby people who we know, who we've been involved with, have opposed this. And actually a lot of, I think, the harmful narrative is coming from outside of rugby. There is a small but quite vocal minority within rugby who will hold up like Ross Ford, like Nemani Nandolo, players like that, go, look, this is amazing, watch him steamroll people, how brilliant is this, he's so much bigger than everyone, he's smashing people, and then at the same time go, oh, but we can't have trans women in rugby because they're too big and they'll smash people. Well, like, do you like that or do you not? Make your mind up.
100%.
You can't.
It's disgraceful, isn't it?
It's horrible.
Sam, were you going to say something before I cut you in with my? So I just any option I get to, any opportunity to mention Ross Ford, and I'll take it. So
no, yeah, I don't blame you. But I was just going to say, it's also that also then comes back to what you were saying about the kind of the narrative around gay and lesbian people in the 80s. It's just that idea of threat. It's that, you know, I left rugby when I was younger because people didn't want to play with me because I might enjoy touching them too much. Should have seen the state on them. There was absolutely not a chance I was enjoying that. But it's that same kind of perception that's where we can make a judgment that you're not welcome in this space. And now, as I said that, everyone here shook their heads in disbelief because we can't believe that, you know, and that wasn't that long ago. That was 15 years ago. People were still having those conversations. And now you look back and go, how did that ever happen? And you could only hope that in 15 years, people look back on this and go, well, that was a bit mental. Imagine if that had actually gone through. That would have been insane, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And I think that touches on a point again that kind of has come up a little bit. And it's something that's thrown up in by kind of more probably the more extreme wing of the of the anti-trans women brigade. But the idea of threat and the story they will throw up saying, you know, that here is one example of where a transgender woman harmed a cis woman because they were in a position to do so, and that's like saying, well, let's ban all TV presenters because of Jimmy Savile. It doesn't, just because one person of a certain, from a certain background or characteristics has done something, doesn't that you cannot then extrapolate that and apply that to everybody.
But you know yourself, Cammy, through society and through history, that's exactly what people with bigoted views will do to further their agenda. That's always been the way. You know, we always laugh at the certain media outlets who it's like such a one-eyed view that they have, and the idea of turning a story round to suit their agenda. It's a tale as old as time, sadly, and what it takes is people to be a wee bit critical in their thinking and actually just step away from the rag they have in front of them, telling them that this is bad, and actually just think about it and think about everything that this ban means. Think about everything it means for people and challenge that. And maybe you'll come to a different viewpoint if you just have a wee 5-minute think about it.
Yeah. Well, look, hopefully the discussion we've had tonight has helped people to kind of understand the position that we've put forward. The right position, obviously, is we all kind of agree and have a consensus on. But that's the purpose of doing this. We wanted to kind of answer some of the points, answer some of the questions. Like I said, I said on Twitter earlier, we're not the BBC. We don't claim to be impartial, so this isn't about giving people the right to reply. We won't be replying to any tweets about this. can assure people, or any other comments aren't going to be replied to. It's just it's a space just to have this discussion and to put it out there, and for people to then go and do with that as they will. Hopefully, we would all hope that after this they'd go and kind of come around to the viewpoint that we've all put forward tonight. But thank you very much, Sam and Elis, for joining us. It's been really useful to have you on. Really, really great to hear the points you've raised.
No, thank you.
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
very much. Been fun.
Johnny and John, thank you as always.
Would be amazing if you guys choose to join us for the next section as well.
Yeah, we should.
What really takes some Scotland rugby fans.
Yeah, well, that's we are going to, as John's alluded to, we're now going to go off and do our Patreon podcast. We as our patrons know, it's a little bit looser, a little bit more fun, a little bit of a kind of a bit more a little less serious than the past hour of the podcast. But so if you're a patron, you can join us for that. For the moment, though, it is goodbye from me and goodbye from Johnny, John, Sam, and Elis.
Bye.
Cheers, folks.